Hi everyone, welcome to today's National Teen Book Club broadcast with me, Sophie, from the National Teen Book Club team. Thank you so much for joining us for our author Q&A today, which will last around 45 minutes. We're joined by B. Fitzgerald today, who is an author and a content creator with a TikTok account that explores mythology and books. B previously worked in various roles in publishing and has a degree in English literature. She also took classes in ancient history. B is passionate about stories and fascinated by the way they endure and resonate through centuries and generations. Our curriculum link to our hero read, as you probably know, is Romeo and Juliet. So our hero read is cuts both ways, and the curriculum link, Romeo and Juliet by Shakespeare. We have those two books there, one contemporary, one classic, that explore similar themes like romance, family, grief, loss, knife crime as well. These books, Girl, Goddess, Queen and The End Crowns All, are also reimaginings of traditional tales, though hers are rooted in mythology. And we're going to speak to Bea about her books, recommended reads and career, and we'd love for you to put your questions forward for her. So submit your questions by scanning the QR code on screen, or you can type in the code that's on screen now into slido.com. You could also type them into the Q&A function on this webpage where you're watching the stream. So just underneath it, there's a Q&A function there where you can add your questions, and you can join in with your questions at any time. Please do let us know via the Q&A function as well if you're experiencing any issues with the stream, and we'll try and help you. So thank you so much, B, for joining us today.
Hi, thanks for having me.
We're going to move on to our first question. Please do tell us a bit more about your YA books.
Yeah, sure. So I have two books that are currently published in YA. Girl, Goddess, Queen, which is a enemies to lovers fake dating reimagining of the myth of Hades and Persephone. We start with Persephone, who has lived on this island her entire life, is very happy there. And then one day her father decides it's time for her to get married, and she's going to have to marry one of the Olympian gods that she's been raised to fear. Her father is king of the heavens, and her mother is got some agriculture vibes, which basically means there's nowhere on Earth that Persephone can run. So she realizes the only place she can escape to is the underworld, where she blackmails the King Hades, who wants absolutely nothing to do with her, into letting her stay just long enough for her to enact a plan of vengeance on the Olympians. And when Hades finds out what she's doing, he wants in. But when the Olympians find out that that's where Persephone is, they realize that the only way she can stay long enough to enact that plan is if these two get married and convince the world that they are wildly in love, which they clearly aren't for now. And it's pink. And my other book, The End Crowns All, is a sapphic reimagining of the Trojan War. We open with Cassandra, who is a priestess of Apollo. And when her long-lost brother Paris, who's at the center of this prophecy of Troy's doom, returns to the city, she goes to visit her patron god Apollo, who offers her prophecy and the power to see what's going to come and guide the city. In exchange for her sleeping with him, she agrees, but later changes her mind, and he curses her so that none of her prophecies will ever be believed, which sucks because she keeps seeing visions of one woman who's going to come to the city and bring war to its shores. But when war finally falls, her and this woman decide to team up in order to save Troy from its inevitable doom.
Those are great pitches, B. How do you find the kind of pitching and marketing of your books? I'm sure you do it so often and you've got it down to a T. So how do you find
I felt that was very rusty. I think by a certain point, you kind of have it down. I used to work in publishing, so I used to pitch other people's books. So it's quite fun for me to be able to pitch my own now. But I think I have a tendency of just talking about them like I would to a friend when I'm explaining all the moving parts of what's going on in the stories. So I think that's probably my best advice for pitching books, is just describe what you find fun about it rather than the beat for beat plot.
Yeah, I love that. Thank you. And we will talk a bit more about your roles in publishing a bit later on, just to stay with your kind of books there. So mythology was, around long before Shakespeare and before Romeo and Juliet. So why do you think love, family, tragedy are timeless themes in literature?
Well, one really fun fact about The End Crowns All is that the title comes from a Shakespeare play. It's from Troilus and Cressida, because Shakespeare also wrote a romance set in the Trojan War. which I think is sort of the vibe that I bring to these books. I'm really interested. I love the fact that people have always been people. I find it really fascinating. When you see like old graffiti that's like Brutus was here, and I'm like, wow, that was basically written on a desk when I was at school, and just seeing those threads of like, oh, people have always been teenagers, they've always fallen in love, they've always told stories to each other, and how those stories kind of continue through the ages, and how the themes within those stories find new relevance, and the stories evolve and they get told in different ways. So the version of Hades and Persephone that I grew up with, for example, is very different from the original myth. So I kind of wanted to write a version of these stories that centered first and foremost themes that I thought were relevant to today's teenagers. So like Girl Goddess Queen, there's a lot about like the pressure that we put on teenagers, the sort of expectation that you make these huge life-changing decisions when you're still sort of figuring out who you are and what you want, and just that feeling of just wanting to buy a little more time. And so I think finding these stories that were so relevant to teenagers in ancient Greece and bringing them through to the present day is something that really interests me. And as I say, like Shakespeare did similar in Troilus and Cressida, because he went to the Trojan War. There are many sources. The main one is the Iliad, which is very much an epic about war. And he wrote a very human story about a romance in the middle of it. So I think that that's something that's really interesting. A lot of Shakespeare's plays sort of center love and romance, because when we're emotional and when we're leading with our feelings, we tend to make decisions that are far more interesting than when we make logical, sensible decisions. And I think, hundreds of years later, that's still sort of how a lot of us tell stories. A lot of us go, what's the worst, most ridiculous decision a character could make right now? And then we roll with it.
That's great. Thank you. And you just kind of touched on the kind of legacy of work as well. Refreshing it just adds to that. So that's really interesting. Thank you. We had a question from Albert. What's your favorite myth?
Oh, I have so many favorite myths. That's a really good question. There's one that I really love, and it's Romeo and Juliet, effectively. There are a few myths in ancient Greece that sort of have this resonance. Spoilers to anyone that hasn't read Romeo and Juliet yet. But there's one where these two children of two rival families are sort of raised, and they're not allowed to see each other, but there's a crack in the wall that they can kind of like speak through, and they fall in love. And then, God, a little bit rusty, but I'm fairly certain basically one of them fakes their death, has been like mauled by lions. The other one finds it, gets devastated, kills themselves, and then the other one also kills themselves. It's almost like that same pattern as Romeo and Juliet, which I think is just very fun. And there's another, Hero and Leander, which has a similar one. Marlowe told that story as well. The sort of writers of that time were constantly finding inspiration in ancient myths, and a lot of my research isn't just what's the ancient world, it's also how has it been retold. So I love that era. And that's basically a similar story of two people that aren't supposed to be in love. Hero's in this tower. Leander swims across the ocean each night to see her, and one night he drowns. So yeah, I love those sort of tragic romances in ancient myth, even though I write happy endings myself.
Thank you. And did you study Romeo and Juliet or any other Shakespeare plays at school? And do you have a different experience referencing them and reading them now?
Yeah, so I studied a lot of Shakespeare plays. I think when I was I did quite a few when I was at university as well. I think when I was at school, we did Merchant of Venice, Romeo and Juliet, Othello, several others that I'm clearly forgetting. But my main experience with Romeo and Juliet is we performed it in drama, and I went to an all-girls school, so I played Paris, and I was told to play him as a very butch, very big, angry man, but obviously that is not my vibe, so I don't think it was the most compelling performance. So I think that was, yeah, and we did it as mods and rockers from the 60s with like warring sort of Greece-esque vibes. So that's my experience of Romeo and Juliet, kind of being a physical theatre petrol pump for Romeo's motorbike, which I don't think Shakespeare included in the original.
That sounds very iconic. I'm sure there'll be some interesting photos floating around somewhere of that
God,
experience. Okay, we had some questions about marketing again. So how do you cross-platform post your marketing content, and which platforms have been most successful for you? How does your time on making content reflect your sales?
Okay. Oh, that's
Great
such a good
question.
question. So I used to work in marketing. As I say, I've worked in publishing. I've done many, many different jobs in publishing. And my first ever job was in marketing at Scholastic. So I used to do the Scholastic book fairs. If you've ever had one of those rock up to your school, I used to brief in all the posters and the leaflets, which was a really fun job. And part of that was the social media schedule. So I have quite a probably more in-depth than it needs to be social media plan. I have like an Excel grid where I kind of post different things, and I have like a list of all my different hooks. And I just try to make sure that I'm hitting different things each day so that I'm not just overwhelming my followers with the same pitch continuously. And it's difficult in part because historically social media has been where you speak to your audience. Whereas because everything is algorithm based now, your posts are trying to attract a new audience all the time. So if I make a TikTok, my assumption is that the people seeing it are the people that don't know who I am. Whereas when I post on Instagram, my assumption is the people who are seeing that already know who I am and are sort of already invested in my books. Which kind of leads to me adapting that a little bit. The exception being Instagram Reels, which like TikTok kind of go off into the ether a little bit more. I find marketing my books really fun. I think it's sort of an extension of the same skill set that I bring to my writing. It's talking about these ancient myths and stories to a new audience and just adapting how you do that for each space. TikTok changes its algorithm a lot. I have a bit of a love-hate relationship with it because every time I have something that works, it changes and it doesn't work. And at this point, I feel like I'm making TikToks solely to repost them as Instagram Reels. But I think trying to experiment on the platform is a nice space to constantly sort of reinvent yourself creatively. I don't really know how it's impacted my sales because I'm not self-published, so I don't have direct access to see my sales data. But I definitely think that especially when it comes to pre-orders before the books come out, sort of drumming up excitement is a really fun part of this role. But I think the thing that impacts it most is just getting to engage with the community. I don't know if my posts have sold my books, but I know that being on those platforms means that I've made friends on those platforms and then they make posts about the books. So just sort of getting that word of mouth success. And I think it's a really exciting time for book publishing in general because reading has become such a community experience and you can just see people reading the books that you're reading rather than it just being you in a room alone. And I think that's a really interesting space to be in.
And talking about TikTok as well, so a lot of it is mythology related content. You have mythology kind of skits. What drew you to the genre as a whole? Was it those ancient history classes that you took at uni? Was it a passion or a love for it before that? And what other genres do you like to read or watch for pleasure?
Sure. So my just for context of anyone that's going to go look at my TikTok, I've been traveling for the last 2 months, so I haven't posted a mythology skit in a while, but I do have plans to start posting them again. So I've always loved Greek mythology. I'm autistic, so it's a special interest, and I think it's a really common special interest. I used to read these sort of reimaginings of it when I was younger. I got like a box set, I think, from a Scholastic book fair of like these reimagined myths. Also, they did box sets of reimagined Shakespeare plays that I also used to read, so clearly those are entwined. And then obviously books like Percy Jackson and stuff when I was a teenager. I didn't study it as my main degree at university because I hadn't done classics or Latin or anything like that. And I loved English literature, but I did choose my university because they let you take modules from outside of your core sort of topic. So I was able to specialize in English literature, but still sort of learn from my own interest. And I very much love things calmly. I get very obsessive and very passionate about it. And I love learning on my own pace. I think, especially at school, I got really swept up in grades and sort of studying things because I was good at them as opposed to studying them because I was interested in them. So things like the sciences that I am not very good at, but I find really fascinating. I started reading a lot of nonfiction books about those, and then similarly started sort of going down my own path of learning more about the myths behind the sort of fictional retellings that I was enjoying in books like Percy Jackson. And I think that's probably one of my favorite things about mythology and the community that I found in terms of talking about it on social media is that there are a lot of people that are learning about it solely out of interest and solely because they care about it and they want to find out more. And there's always something to find out. Like even when you've been studying it for 20 years and it's your full-time job and you're an academic researcher, you will find an undiscovered text with a new spin on a myth. So it's really fun that it's this thing that's thousands of years old, but still feels very alive and adaptable and changing. And obviously we're bringing like our own perceptions to it, which alters things. And yeah, I really, really love mythology. And I love the way that no one that loves mythology calmly. I read broadly though. I love fantasy books. I read a lot of young adult and a lot of middle grade books because I worked in children's publishing, and I think those books are great and never stop being great. And then I also read a fair amount of like historical Greek mythology reimaginings as well. I love books, and I also read a lot of nonfiction books, but I tend to do those in audiobook instead. So I normally have about 3 books on the go at once.
That's great to hear. Thank you. And we had a question about books from St. John Bosco Arts College. What books did you read as a teen?
Ooh, so good. So my favorite books when I was a teenager, well, one of my favorite series was The Hunger Games, and I'm currently reading the new Hunger Games book at the moment. So that's just a really incredible thing that sort of followed me from teen years to adult. I also really loved classics when I was studying and a teen. So books like To Kill a Mockingbird and The Bell Jar were some of my favorites when I was a teenager. It was also the era of like John Green. That was very dominant in my school. It was sort of like a golden age for young adult books. I think before me, maybe if you went back like 10 years further, books for teenagers didn't really exist. You just sort of read adult books. You sort of leapt from children's books to Lord of the Rings. And I grew up in an era where like, wow, did you know that teenagers like reading? We should publish books specifically for them. And there were all these absolutely brilliant dystopia series, you know, Divergent, The Hunger Games, which I've mentioned. And there were books like Percy Jackson, and also those sort of contemporary romance books by, you know, authors like John Green, Maureen Johnson, David Levithan. And those are still some of the authors that I love reading today.
And how do you go about creating or developing your ideas? That's coming from the Cumberland School.
I'm very character-led. So especially when you've got a myth in front of you, it's sort of a different experience to when you're coming up with a plot by yourself, because I also write adult thrillers, so I do that as well. But when I'm writing my YA books and I sort of have this story that I'm using as a central point, much like Shakespeare did with his poems and stories, I'm sure we have the exact same process. I kind of think about not just the plot points of the myth, but also the thematic resonance of the myth. Like, what is this myth talking about outside of the allegory of it? Is it trying to give some sort of moralistic message? Is it connecting to a sort of experience like first love or something like that? And I try and draw those threads through to the current contemporary experiences. And the characters kind of form themselves from there. I also read widely around the myths. So, for example, Girl Goddess Queen is a reimagining of Hades and Persephone, but there are so many myths of Persephone. So the first time we ever encounter her in any text is in Homer, and it's Odysseus scared that he needs to like leave the underworld. He's trying to connect with spirits, and he's scared that Persephone is going to send a Medusa head after him. And the first time we ever meet her, it's this hero who's terrified of Persephone, and she's described as the dread queen of the underworld. And the underworld is consistently referred to as her space, not Hades' space, which really helped form the character of Persephone in Girl Goddess Queen, because if I'd only looked at that one myth of her in relation to Hades, it's a very different her to who we see in other myths. So I do a lot of really broad research, and I draw a character out of that. And then when I have character in my head, they sort of run wild. I like to have a plan down. I think I work best with a sort of chapter outline that creates the whole book. But when I actually write it, sometimes the characters go off and do silly things that I didn't have planned. So, for example, in A Beautiful Evil, which I have publishing this summer, I had a chapter where the characters were supposed to kiss. And when I actually wrote it, they end up having the biggest argument I think I've ever written. And I was like, okay, sometimes characters just aren't ready to do the thing that you had planned for them. And that's also like one piece of advice I give quite often to people that are trying to write or that are struggling with their writing. I think sometimes we try and make characters do things because we need them to happen for the plot, but the plot should happen because of the things your characters are doing instead. So just constantly asking if things feel tricky, would this be a decision that this character would make? And if not, what would they do in this situation? Allowing characters to make mistakes and not be perfect.
Real, thank you. And we had a question come through. I mean, you mentioned that you are autistic there, so hopefully this is a question that you feel comfortable answering, and no worries if not. How does being autistic influence your writing? Could you talk to us about that a bit more? You've just about the process there. Has it affected that in any way or shaped it?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I definitely think my process is a little different because of my neurodivergence. So something that I've had specifically with the End Council and with my thriller that I'm writing at the moment, but I didn't have a Girl Goddess Queen and then things went dark, is hyperfocus, which just is sort of like your book consumes your world and you don't want to do anything but your book. And you'll see friends and you'll be annoyed that you're spending time with friends because you want to go back to the book and it's sort of all you care about. And that's amazing in terms of getting words down on the page. In terms of when that doesn't take over, you kind of have to trick your autistic brain into seeing your book as your own special interest. So just sort of submerging yourself in the world of your book as much as you can, which is obviously very easy for me with mythology because I can read around the topics. If not, kind of having like a playlist that puts me in the headspace of my world, having some mood boards and pictures to just constantly keep my world as like a presence in my life. Very useful. It makes the editing process a little bit harder because when people give you feedback on your books, they try and be nice about it. But as an autistic girl, I take it literally. So I've had instances where my editors have been like, oh, we want to reduce this and the focus on this just a little bit. And then I've reduced it just a little bit. And what they mean is remove entirely. And I'm like, oh, but you didn't say that.
Yeah, so you just kind of need those clear instructions and clear guidance from your team. Okay, next question. Why do you love writing? Why do you love being a storyteller? And why would you recommend your job or your industry?
I don't know if it comes back to being neurodivergent, but I honestly think this is probably a broad experience of just sometimes feeling like your own head is a little bit too loud of a place. And I really like getting into someone else's head for a bit and sort of thinking about different lives and different experiences and how that would sort of impact who you are and how you perceive the world. I think I'm someone that writes because I want to discover things, and it could be as simple as just discovering how a character would react in a certain situation. It can also be like to expound on like big themes or feelings and sort of explore those in a sort of safe space. Things that are maybe like big and scary in the world that I can put onto the page and make sense of within a Word document. I really love the creativity of sort of putting words down on a page and creating whole universes. It's just really fun. I think a lot of the things that I enjoy tend to be sort of linked to that. And I think a lot of people are storytellers, even if they don't consider themselves storytellers. You know, if you play The Sims, you're telling stories. I play Dungeons and Dragons. That's another way of like getting into someone's head and kind of exploring a world. I think a lot of the sort of things that I'm drawn to are in the fictional space and enable you to sort of tell those stories. And I think being able to do it as a job is just such a privilege because I was writing long before I ever thought about doing it as a career. And I think that's my biggest thing. Like, yes, I recommend this so much. But as I said, like when I was at school, I got very swept up in like, what am I good at? And sort of tying everything to a sense of achievement. And writing to me was just doing something solely because I enjoyed it. So whether it's writing for you or whether it's something else, whether it's a hobby that you're like, well, I can't make this my career, like that's fine. That's where you should be putting your energy because everyone needs a space that they're doing solely for enjoyment. So when I first started writing, I was writing fan fiction because it was really fun and because I cared about these characters in this world and because my friends liked it too and it was something for us to talk about and because there were all these communities to discuss it. And it was, yes, I enjoyed putting words down on a page, but it was just this bigger sense of like doing something for joy and centering joy in my life. I'm really lucky in that I have made a career out of it, but I hesitated for a good long time because I didn't know if sort of tying it to income and achievement in the way that it has and to sales would sap the joy of writing from me. Thankfully, it hasn't, but I've spoken to writers for whom it has. And often their advice is to just go write something for fun. Don't think about what's going to be right for the market, write the book that you're interested in seeing, or write fan fiction again, even though you haven't done it for a few years, just to kind of rediscover that joy. And yeah, I'm just very lucky that I get to do a job where my own happiness is centered rather than need to pay bills and send emails and please people.
Yeah, that's so lovely. And we had a question. I mean, you spoke about writing fiction and writing fan fiction there. This question was from Thurfield. Do you like reading nonfiction? Is nonfiction a direction you would go down in the future, maybe?
I love reading nonfiction, but as I say, I tend to read it mostly on audiobook unless I'm reading it for like research purposes. I think part of that is compartmentalizing from when I used to work in publishing, because as I say, when you're doing something for your job, how much do you want to do it outside of work? So when I was an editor, I edited women's fiction and rom-coms. And then when I was reading in my own personal time, I was reading fantasy. So I think just having like a genre that I read in a different format sort of just helps me not get too burnt out with the amount. I basically decided I liked books and then made it my entire life. So I was like, this is how I relax, but also what I do for my day job. And also my main hobby is writing them. And so just kind of putting them in different brackets was very helpful for me to keep enjoying them. I think in terms of me writing nonfiction, I don't know if I can kind of take things seriously enough, in all honesty. I think my books are very irreverent. And even when I am being serious, I'm also being a little bit silly at the same time. And I think that's sort of who I am as a person. I think it's definitely what comes across in my TikToks. It's like, yeah, these are sort of educational, but they're also very, very silly. So if there's a market for that in nonfiction, maybe I will find it. But I think for now, my focus is on fantasy and fiction and just those sort of entirely different worlds that I can escape into for a little while.
Great. And you do it so well as well. We had a follow-up question based on what you said before about the sales data and how that related to your kind of marketing social media platforms. And you said you didn't have access to that data. So a practical question, who has access to that data? How can people find that information if they are authors in the future?
I mean, they can find it out by just asking their publishing team. But I'm very much a keep me in the dark about all things numbers. And I think it just comes back to that sort of, I want to keep on writing because I enjoy it and I don't want to get too distracted with what the market is doing. And also, that's sort of not my job. That's my publisher's job. And I think as soon as I kind of take on the weight of responsibility for selling my book as well as writing it, it will just get very tiring and very exhausting. And that's a reason that I didn't self-publish. I wanted to find a team to make it a group project, to make it our book rather than my book, so that I could put my focus into the enjoyable parts and let someone else deal with the less enjoyable parts. So I could access it. I think accessing it on a weekly basis might be a bit much because it would involve someone behind the scenes going and looking it up. When I've worked in publishing, you have access to the data. There are various systems and databases. And sometimes, like when I have a new book published, I will borrow a friend's login that they should not be giving me, but they do, which is sort of like the only time that I really get in my head about sales, because I feel like the first week sales, which is normally what impacts charts, and it's normally comes from pre-orders, which are so important in supporting authors. Those feel a little bit more within my control because those are stemming from my own marketing. Whereas I think trying to get a read on how your TikTok is impacting your sales, for example, is quite difficult, because one of the biggest metrics that we look at in terms of is a TikTok performing is how many people have bookmarked it, because that means that they are saving it for later. That means that when they're next in a bookshop, they will go to their bookmarks and be like, this book. So how do you sort of measure it? Because that could be weeks down the line from when they first saw the TikTok. And you're just sort of constantly guessing and constantly trying to explain something that, maybe in a bookshop far away, an bookseller is really hand selling your book, and then you're sort of interpreting that as like relating to that. And as a very logical and also, as previously mentioned, autistic person, I think trying to draw lines where they're difficult to 100% say for certain would just drive me around in circles. So I try to keep myself in the dark as much as possible.
Yeah, it does sound like there's too many grey areas in that. Actually, just related to that question, if you want to be kept in the dark about numbers, how do you feel about reviews? Do you ever look at reviews of your books? No. Okay.
No, I get like some authors do, and I'm friends with authors that do, and it could not be me. I am so sensitive, and I know that you need a thick skin in this industry, but I do not have one yet, so I avoid it so hard. I don't go out searching for it. That said, I really love being in a position to like be able to talk directly to my audience via my social media platforms. I'm very active on there in a way that other authors aren't. And at present, I still have the ability to tag me in things open, which means sometimes I'm tagged in negative reviews, and sometimes it ruins your whole day, and sometimes you just don't think about it again. The flip side is that you also get tagged in lots of lovely positive reviews. So if readers have invited me into that space by tagging me, I might have a look. But even then, so sometimes I'll get tagged in one of my foreign editions, and then the post will be in another language, and I'll do the quickest of skims. And if I can't see 5 out of 5, I do not hit see translation, because I'd rather not know. I'm like, lovely picture. Let's leave it at that.
That's totally fair. We also wanted to know as well, related to that, you just said about building a thicker skin. So I assume you're working towards that in some way. How can our young people on the call also do that? Have you got any advice around that?
I think my biggest thing is to just contextualize negativity. For example, and I've had it because I've worked in publishing as well, right? So before I was an author, I was an editor. And that meant sometimes I would read a review for a book that I'd edited being like, this book needed another edit. And I'm like, oh no, like I was getting criticism before I even became a published author. But I think contextualizing the negativity. So for example, when my editors give me feedback on what I need to improve on the book, that's not them critiquing the book. That's them sort of, if they're saying less of one thing, it's because they want to see more of a thing that you're doing really well. And similarly with readers, when a book is like negative, it's normally a negative review is, this isn't the book I thought I was going to get. And that's fine, because everyone has different ideas of the perfect book, right? Like I think if everyone in this call thought of the perfect book or their favorite book, they'd all have so many different answers. So you not being everyone's favorite is fine. And I think trying to keep your eyes on the page and think to yourself, what does my perfect book look like? What do I want this story to be? And I think sometimes that helps with the negativity. So for example, I get criticism sometimes, wildly, even though my books are clearly perfect. And some of the criticism I get, I agree with. Sometimes I don't like it when they use modern language in ancient stories. I'm like, that's so fair. If that's your preference, I understand why my books would not be for you. Me personally, I see my books as like a translation of an ancient world that I'm writing for a contemporary audience. So that's a decision I've made that I stand by. So I think if you're in a position where you're able to stand by the decisions you've made, it makes it a little bit easier, and just appreciate that everyone has different opinions and they're valid. It is tricky though. I think that's also sort of one of my biggest tips is it's okay to be upset by negativity. I think sometimes we put so much weight and burden on ourselves to sort of move on and not overthink it. And I think it is like scientifically, I think they've done studies, and it's something like one piece of criticism requires 10 pieces of positive things. Like on a purely scientific basis, criticism lodges in our heads in a way that positivity doesn't. So if you are finding yourself upset by negativity and you're building that thicker skin, it's okay to allow yourself to be upset. And then hopefully, with time, you can build that thicker skin. But I also think that putting too much pressure on yourself to be fine with it can almost backfire.
This might relate as well to what you've just said, but we had another question come in about, do you ever regret writing specific plots or characters into your books? And how do you prevent that, if so? That's from Thurfield.
I don't think so. I do have like a sort of, if I wrote this now, I'd write it differently. But I think that just means that I'm growing as an author. So I think just everything like that, it's like, yes, but also I caveat it with, well, I wrote this book at 21 and I'm writing better books now, or my better book is not someone else's better book, things like that. So I don't think I regret it in that sense. I think one of the most frustrating things is just that, as I say, mythology is always sort of an ongoing conversation. There's always new sources being found or new translations that bring something new to the original, which means that sometimes you find things out that you're like, God, I wish I'd included that. Like, I wish I knew that then. Like, I recently found out that the River Lethe in the underworld has flowers along it. And part of my inspiration for Girl Goddess Queen is that one of the big areas of the Greek underworld is called the Fields of Asphodel, which is like fields of flowers, which meant how could that exist before Persephone, goddess of flowers, got there? So part of the plot is her crafting the underworld. So it sort of becomes an origin myth for that. So finding out that the River Lethe also had flowers, I was like, why did I not know this then? So there are just little details like that no one else would care about that really deeply sit in my soul. But I could always mention it in a future book, or I could just let it go like a normal person.
Thank you. And we had a question from Albert. Who is your favourite god or goddess in mythology?
I really like Hestia. I think in a world where the Greek gods are doing all sorts of nonsense and really hurting a lot of mortals, it's just quite nice to have also quite importantly, and in terms of so like Greek mythology is interesting because it's not like religion as we would think of it now. The role that it had in ancient Greek society was very much sort of a collective cultural zeitgeist. And so you had these gods that existed within the context of religion in terms of there being these temples and ways of worship. And those versions of the gods are very different to the gods that are then depicted in mythology that we would associate, which are the stories. And those stories are normally allegories. They were also often told in like plays. So they were told for entertainment, which means that you also have playwrights reworking the myths or throwing something new in for the sake of winning a competition. So everyone writes with agendas. So I think given all of that, it's really fun to have Hestia, who is goddess of home and hearth, which in the cultural context of worship was so important because this is a world where we don't have nice brick houses and a snake really could just crawl through your door at any moment. So your home and your hearth needed to be protected. So she was such a culturally important goddess. And then in the context of that fictional mythology world where, as I say, Zeus in mythology, very different from Zeus in the culture of worship, she is just not really involved and just sort of sits calmly while all of this chaos goes around her. And I think that makes her a very interesting character, that she doesn't get swept away with everything else that the other gods do.
Great, thank you. And we had 2 questions from the field, which I'll link together. So the first one, how long would you say it takes for you to write a book? And also, can you talk to us a bit more about the practicalities of getting published? So they want to know specifically, did you approach the publisher? Did they approach you? And just talking about the editor as well, and the process of that.
Yeah, sure. So how long does the book take me? It varies. Girl Goddess Queen took me a year, but I was also working full time. I just moved to London, so I was like not writing every day. The End Council, which was much longer, took me 3 months because the hyperfocus took over. And I've just finished writing a book in 6 weeks because of that. And that's with me doing it full time, so I don't have to go to school or anything. And then the flip side of that is I have some books like Then Things Went Dark, which took me 2 years. So it really varies. It also varies depending on like edit deadlines. Like sometimes I have to stop writing a new book to go work on a previous one and things like that. I'm someone that can juggle multiple books, but I can't juggle like them in the same day. Like I can do 2 months on one book and then do 2 months on another book, but I can't spend like the morning on one book and then the afternoon on another. So it varies. In terms of the practicalities of getting published, the way that it works is that you write your book and then you query literary agents, who are sort of like the first sort of gate to get past. And everyone should have representation. So everyone should have a literary agent because they act as sort of a go-between between the author and the publisher, and they protect both parties. They stop authors being taken advantage of by publishers, and they also can kind of navigate difficult conversations between the two, and they also negotiate contracts. So a lot of publishing houses don't accept submissions from people that don't have a literary agent representing them, because it just protects both parties if there is that sort of intermediary person. There are a few exceptions. So digital first imprints, so publishers that might only publish books in ebook and not do a physical book, sometimes they accept open submissions. Mills and Boon, which specialize in romance, they accept open submissions. But for the broad part, most mainstream publishers, you need a literary agent. So the way that that works is you write a query letter, which is you pitching your book. You write a synopsis, which is not quite a selling document. It's just sort of a beat for beat, this is what happens in the book. And I used to be a literary agent. So the reason that's really useful is that it shows that you have an understanding of plot structure and how stories should be formed, and everything's going to come to a nice resolution. You send a sample, and then they might request the full. And if they like it, they will offer you representation. And if you get a literary agent, then the literary agent then sends it to publishers, which is called being on submission. And then if a publisher likes it, the literary agent will let all the other publishers know. So you might end up in a situation with an auction, and then the literary agent will sort of manage all of that. And then you as an author are just kind of sat there. You might get asked to go to nice meetings, and then your book sells and you sign the contract and you start working with an editor at the publishing house. And then it's sort of like a little 3-way team between you, your literary agent, and the editor. And the editor will sort of go back and forth with you on the manuscript. And then sort of alongside that, there are all these other roles in publishing, like marketing, publicity, sales, rights. So there are loads of jobs in books that aren't necessarily the ones that you might immediately think of, and they're all really interesting. So if it's something you're interested in, I encourage you to go research all of those. But basically, you get a team of people whose job it is to have specialist knowledge about how to sell your book to readers. And so you as the author just sort of get to focus on writing the book and editing the book and then writing the next book.
Thank you. That was really detailed. Do you think then that your experience in publishing really helped with the process of becoming an author? And also we had a question from David. What A-levels or GCSEs did you take to enter a degree at the University of, was it Reading that you went to?
Yeah. So publishing, I think working in publishing meant that I knew these processes. So it wasn't like stressful and scary. Publishing as an industry historically has been very much like a who you know industry, and it sort of encouraged a lot of people from the upper echelons of society to just sort of talk to each other. That sort of changed now. And when I was trying to get a job in it, it was very much about networking and making connections because I didn't have those contacts previously. I think a lot of authors talking about how to get published helps sort of lift that curtain. But when I was applying, it was still kind of shrouded in mystery that I thankfully was able to see through because I worked in industry. I think if I was higher up in publishing at the time, it might have helped me get a book deal. I might have known the right person, but I was still quite low down on the ladder. So I don't think that helped. But yeah, I think it definitely took some of the stress out because I knew that as an editor, sometimes I turned down a book that I loved because I couldn't see how to sell it to an audience, or because we already had something really similar on our list, or because this wasn't my remit and I was being tasked with publishing different kinds of books. So I knew that no's weren't always personal, and I think that helped keep me grounded. In terms of my A-levels, I did English literature, psychology, religious studies, and I did biology to AS level.
Thank you. And we've probably got time for one more question. The time has flown today. Do you have any advice for young people or your younger self around achievements or success, or kind of tips for creating a success story?
I think redefining what success means to you and not letting the world around you tell you what is successful and what success counts as. I think it's very easy to get, especially when you're living in a world where success has been boiled down to like numbers and percentage points and letter grades or number grades or whatever it is. I think does success for you look like finishing a book? Does it look like getting your homework in on time? There are all these enormous pressures on teenagers, and I think just doing your best and being true to yourself and what matters to you is far more important. And just sort of not comparing yourself to the people around you because their version of success and achievement is going to look different. And I think if you're constantly trying to move the barrier of what counts as success, you're not going to allow yourself to actually celebrate achieving it. You're going to just constantly be looking at the next goal and get very swept up in treating your life like a list of checkboxes. And life is about having fun and experiencing things.
Oh, that's such brilliant advice to end on. Thank you so much, Bea, for joining us today and for sharing so many of your experiences in the world of an author and in publishing as well. It's just been really insightful. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, everyone. It's been really fun.
Thank you, Bea. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today for the session and for your brilliant questions as well. We really appreciate you submitting them through the Q&A. Next week is our last session for our Cuts Both Ways book club. So that's our final session. I'll Meet the Author Talk Wednesday, 26th of March at 10 a.m. with Candice Brathwaite. A reminder that as a bonus for this term, by attending a session for Hero Read 2, you will be automatically entered into a competition to win a free bundle of books. So that's your last chance next week to be entered into that draw. Please head to our National Teen Book Club webpage for more information about our sessions and to register your groups. You can also find more broadcasts on the Speakers for Schools website. Thank you, everyone. We hope you have a lovely day for the rest of the day today and enjoy your week. And we'll see you again soon. Thanks, everyone.